My name is Martin Fregoso, and I am with Placer County Office of Education.
Josh Schultz from Napa County office.
We have for you a very simple budget summary presentation, so I hope you're not expecting something that is dramatically difficult. So really, the section has the four main boxes at the beginning. So the first one, simple number that's going to be input entered, that is the total general fund expenditures. Box number 2 will have all the dollars set aside for the planned services and actions to meet the goals of the LCAP within the year. Box 3 will be the description of all the general fund expenditures that are not included in the LCAP. And finally, the final box will have the expected funding through the LCF funding formula. And where we can find direction for this will be in the CISESA LCAP manual, pages 14 and 15, also page 32, and LCAP instructions on page 2. So for our sample, we have 48 million would be the dollar amount that we're looking at for the total general fund budget expenditures. And we're looking at the FIGMAT district LCF calculator page that any district would fill out. And for our example, we have expenditures, actual funding of $38,266,000. And for the rest of the exercise, I'll have Josh.
Okay. So you've got some sample numbers in front of you, and I'm trusting that everyone has identified, kind of the answers as Martin has pointed out. So here's a sample section filled out for you. You'll note that in the second box, right, which is supposed to show the total funds budgeted for actions and services, because it would take far too long for you to try to go through an LCAP and find all the actions and services and add up the numbers, we're assuming that that box is correct. But for the rest of it, we've got an entry for total general fund expenditures of $42 million, and we've got a description of funds not included in the LCAP, and we have a number for total projected LCFF revenues. So why don't you take, say, 2 minutes at your table to discuss whether or not this is approvable based upon the information presented. So looking ahead here, first of all, again, on the piece about, are all the total funds for the actions and services in the LCAP, a reminder that exercise, of course, will require, unless, and some districts probably are trying to do something to actually track this in their accounting system, but for most of them, probably not. So it's probably going to be an exercise of having to go through the LCAP, look at all the numbers that are in the individual actions boxes, and we've got an illustration of what that looks like here. That section will be covered later, and seeing if the total that they've listed on the plan summary corresponds to the total of all those actions and services. Later on in this presentation, I think there's a little discussion about materiality, and I think this is one area where it's probably good to kind of keep that in mind, because that may be a very tedious hand-done exercise in many districts, and so you'll have to consider if they make a slight math error or they round a little bit, does it really matter or not? But we're not going to go through that exercise here today. So looking at what you actually had presented in front of you. So, $42 million versus an actual total general fund expenditures budget of, 48 point something million. That's probably too big of a gap to forgive there. Some rounding might be allowable in the context of summary, but in this case, they're off by 13%. If it's early on, you might have a discussion with them about why the gap is there. Maybe the person doing the LCAP didn't check with the person doing the budget about the final numbers or something like that. But if it came to you for approval, the number is clearly off. And I point this out because originally, actually, we had an example with 47 million, and there was a dialogue among the people preparing the slides. Is that too much of a gap to allow or not? So we tried to make it obvious here. I have a hard time sometimes with these approval versus not approvable exercises because, no one single point, I think, in an LCAP is necessarily going to say we cannot approve the LCAP, right? There's got to be some context about what the overall document looks like. But this number is clearly way off. I think even more clear in my mind is this description of, general fund expenditures that are not in the LCAP. And I don't know if anybody came to a different conclusion at your tables, but I think the point is, there needs to be some actual description of, what those expenditures are, not just a statement that, we only left out things that aren't required. Does anybody have any comments about that or different conclusions? Tammy?
In your explanation of why this isn't approvable, and you say because of the difference between box 1 and box 2, but I've seen scenarios where box 2 might have a non-general fund expenditures in there and make that number large. And so it's not just box 1 and box 2, it's general fund versus general fund in both boxes.
Okay. Absolutely, that's a very important point. And so, another example of that, before you say not approve, you want to understand, what the numbers are and why there's a difference. But for instance, our example didn't have any, if you look back at the general fund budget page, it didn't have any transfers out. But a district might, for example, have a significant transfer out to another fund that involves an expenditure that they want to include and capture in their LCAP. And they might legitimately say, we want to take that general fund expenditure line plus the transfers out and put that number in, right? So there are special circumstances where it may not be as cut and dry as what we're talking about. Tammy gave us another example of that. So the final point on this slide, of course, is that, there is the $38 million, so that exactly corresponds to the LCFF calculator number. I'll point out there again, too, an example, in an earlier iteration of this presentation, there is a line on the general fund budget that says LCFF revenues, right? But we decided not to go with that number because, of course, consider, for instance, a basic aid district that might include a whole bunch of excess property taxes that they might legitimately not want to consider for the purposes of, this particular calculation. So the calculator gives you precisely the LCFF entitlement as determined by the state and the rules of unduplicated pupils, and et cetera.
Really close to it, okay. Trying to decide based on approvable or non-approvable in looking at this document, when we're looking at the code to determine that, are we stating that it's non-approvable if they have the wrong numbers because they're not adhered to the template, or are we tying that back to the code that the budget doesn't support? Because when we're looking at things and we're trying to look at what would be the basis for non-approvable, we've had districts put wrong numbers in there and we're making changes and fixes, but then trying to tie it to the code, for those pieces of the code. Does that make sense? Does the question make sense?
Yes, I think so. I think the answer on the $42 million number is its correspondence with the budget. That would be my read, and if anybody else has a different take. On this second box, I think it's more about adherence to the template. They're not really responding to the prompt. Any other questions, since we're slightly ahead of schedule? Okay, thank you for your time. We'll go to the next section.